Well, happy Halloween. Hi there. My name is Sheldon McLeod, and this is my opportunity here on the Saltwire Network to talk about what's going on in our world. As I mentioned, I was doing a little traveling, so it's always great to get back home, back to, your own bed and, make you appreciate the small things in life. And it is Halloween, and something came across my email inbox this morning that I wanted to share with you. It's from the folks at Students Nova Scotia, and they have launched a campaign. And just so we can all share in this information, maritime students launch a joint More Than Tuition affordability campaign. Student leaders from New Brunswick Student Alliance, UPEI Students Union, and Students Nova Scotia are launching what they're calling More Than Tuition Student Affordability Campaign. And yeah, the price of everything these days is skyrocketing. And it's obvious to the folks who are invested in their future that, it's kind of tough to study and work. Lydia Houck is here with us. And are you the executive director of Students Nova Scotia?
I am, yes.
So tell me a little bit about your experience. And you wanted to go to university, and you were doing your budget plans. And I'm sure if other students are listening, or parents of students, they're probably going to want to know, what do you have to do these days to try and make a plan for attending university in 2022, 2023?
Absolutely. Yeah. So when I started university a number of years ago, and even at that point in time, the challenges around, first of all, finding information about the costs you would be facing as a student, and then how to be budgeting those costs, and even where to access support, that sort of information wasn't really available necessarily. And what I did find is that costs such as housing, textbooks, things like that you don't really think of when you think about the cost of being a student, are often on par, or in some cases more than the cost of that tuition and whatever it costs to actually be on campus in the first place. So within that, kind of the focus of the More Than Tuition campaign, and where that idea initiated from, is saying certainly the costs of being on campus, or tuition, classes, things like that, are incredibly important pieces of being a student, but they're not the complete picture when it comes to the puzzle of all the costs of being a student and all those sorts of things. So the first focus, I think, of the campaign, building off of my experience and the experience of many other students when it comes to coming to university or college, is really highlighting what those costs are, what the true costs are for students around all of those sorts of things. And then more importantly, how we can ensure that the supports available to students actually match up with the realities of those costs. When we think back to when I first went to school, I took out student loans. I'm a Nova Scotia student, so I was able to access loans through Nova Scotia. And even at that time, the maximum amount of loan that was available to me didn't cover the full cost of my degree. And that was a number of years ago. So the costs have only climbed since then. So another piece of the puzzle is being able to look at programs like provincial financial assistance across the Maritimes and say, how could these be updated to reflect the actual costs of being a student in 2022? So there's a couple focuses, but the first one right now is really sharing this information and also hearing from students about how they're being impacted by these rising costs day to day.
Now, you and I were talking just briefly that this year is just zooming right along. And I want to know, because just a few months ago, we were talking about affordability for housing and the availability of housing either on campus or outside in community. A lot of students have to kind of combine their resources in order to afford a place to stay. How is that now? Is it how dire is it? How tough is it? How much of a challenge is it? How does that fit in with this affordability issue?
I would say it's an incredible challenge, and I would say it's integral to the affordability issue. I think we know, of course, that housing, particularly in the HRM, the costs are very high, the stock is very low. But I think a couple important pieces to highlight are those challenges are actually being seen across the province. We look at Cape Breton, we look at other rural areas. The ability to find a house or an apartment or anything like that is often really challenging. And even in cases where students have found housing, which a lot of folks had to scramble to do at the beginning of September, that's often quite outside of their price range. So a lot of folks had to trade, the need to have a roof over their head for something within their price range. So I think a lot of folks are struggling right now to balance all the other costs of being a student against the cost of housing. We had a testimonial come in this morning of a student saying, right now the cost of tuition is the same as the cost of housing, and my student loan only covers one of those two things. So a lot of students are making those tough decisions of, what am I going to cut to cover the things I need? In some cases, that might be textbooks. In some cases, that might be groceries or travels home to visit family or whatever that is. So what we are seeing is that there's a lot of give up to get when it comes to making sure that you can get through the door of university, but also stay there till the end. And the other piece to highlight there is that that does obviously have impact on academics, which is the primary reason that students are here. When you're trying to budget out how you're going to afford your next rent check, how you're going to buy that mandatory textbook for your first year course, those sorts of things. What it means is that you're going to have to say, well, I'm taking on additional hours at work and things like that, which we also know impact your academic and your mental well-being and all those sorts of things. So I think, the housing piece is certainly a big driver of this. It's not the only piece of the puzzle, but I think as we're looking to build supports both literally and metaphorically going forward around the housing conversation, having students and post-secondary communities be central to that is going to be really important in maintaining and hopefully increasing post-secondary access.
This is a social media campaign. It's a media campaign. Walls of cost. You explain how you're asking students to share their experiences. So tell me what you're hearing and tell me how that's going to help.
Absolutely. So yes, as you mentioned, the first kind of piece of the campaign is that social media side of it. It's sharing information about the cost and collecting virtual feedback from students about how each individual envelope of cost has impacted them. The other piece is each of the campuses that's participating does have some sort of physical wall on campus with different questions, be that what are the hidden costs of being a student, what are the largest costs, and folks are adding things to that billboard talking about their experiences. And I think the first piece of that is to ensure that students realize that this is something that's on the radar. This is something that people are talking about, and it's something that's important. But more directly, and this is where it falls in the purview of these advocacy organizations, is how we take this feedback that we're hearing from students, their stories, their experiences, and we bring that forward to folks who are in decision-making spaces, whether that's university administration, whether that's other stakeholders, whether that's government, and say, here's why, first of all, students are so critical to our provinces and in so many different ways. But secondly, here's how they're experiencing challenges, not only in accessing education, but being able to stay there, being able to stay in the province after graduation. I think sometimes there's this myth that the impacts of debt and the cost of education are only limited to your time in study, but we know that those sorts of things have really long-lasting repercussions for folks' ability to get out there and contribute to the workforce and build their lives in the region. So I think it's really important for us to say, not only here are the short-term impacts of all these different costs, but also here's the potential impacts on a societal level if it's not something that we're addressing now within this overall affordability conversation.
So what a modernized student assistance program look like?
Absolutely. I can speak for the Nova Scotia context. So within Nova Scotia, we actually haven't increased the maximum amount that a student can receive from the financial assistance program since 2017. Obviously, costs have increased pretty significantly since then. I think in Halifax alone, we've seen over a 22% increase in the average cost of rent, let alone so many other different things. Another piece of that, specifically on the housing side of the conversation, is we've actually seen that the monthly allocation for housing is $500 a month for financial assistance. And I think it wouldn't be a surprise to anyone that regardless of where you are in Nova Scotia, regardless of whether you have one roommate, two roommates, three roommates, it's going to be tough to find anything for that part of the price. So within Nova Scotia, at least, the conversation and the things that we're going to be prioritizing is, first of all, increasing those maximums, because we know even prior to the pandemic, 1 in 5 student loan borrowers had need that was well above those maximums. And then also looking at how we can ensure that allocations for things like housing actually reflect the real cost of those sorts of services.
Curious to know, because I'm sure some people say, well, university students, we hear about parties and good times and spending money perhaps that you don't have, or as we're talking about, the affordability crisis. What about budgeting? How is that a part of this conversation? Is there enough focus on that, do you think?
I think that's an excellent question and a really important one. I will say we hear from students all the time for whom they haven't had that education, whether it's not something that was covered in their secondary classes, whether it's something like that they've really not given tools to do that. I know there's a lot of conversations around that happening right now. And something else we're actually doing with the campaign is we're holding a free online financial literacy session in collaboration with some folks in the financial sort of area to sit down with students and say, first of all, here are some of the things you need to know about budgeting. Here are some of the questions we can answer and things like that. So the short answer is, I think it's very important. I think it's something that there needs to be more focus upon, whether that's within high schools having those conversations or whether it's universities stepping up and saying, when our students arrive first week of classes, we acknowledge that this is a new arena for a lot of them and that we have to take some additional steps to support them and ensure they're making informed financial and academic decisions.
So, Lydia, this is your job. You're working with Students Nova Scotia. How many of the other university students that you know have a part-time or even a more job, some kind of freelance or something that they can help offset that? Because ultimately, you're talking about increasing the amount of debt that students have to take on. So I'm just wondering how that balancing act works.
Absolutely. So I will say, within Nova Scotia, we're pretty fortunate to have a financial assistance model where the majority of that debt is actually forgiven when you graduate from your first degree and things like that. So increasing maximums doesn't necessarily equate to taking on additional debt, but the reality is that for the majority of students, I would say almost every student I know has some sort of part-time or even full-time job. We know students who are working upwards of 20, even closer to 30 hours a week on top of their studies to finance those sorts of things. They're taking on 2 jobs and things like that. And obviously that has impacts for their academics. So I think it's very common for students to be working at the same time. I think sometimes there's a perception that, students, as you said, are just there to party and have fun and not do anything outside of their classes. And I would say for the vast majority of students, increasingly, as the price tag of education rises, folks have to be making intentional decisions and doing the work behind the scenes to make sure they can stay there. So I think in general, it's top of mind for a lot of folks. And I think people are doing everything they can to support themselves. And in a lot of cases, it's still not enough.
So what would have to happen for you to say this campaign is a success?
I think the first piece, and the one that we're doing right now, is getting, first of all, engagement from students. And that's something, even in the first several hours of the campaign, we've heard an outpouring from a lot of students of saying, here's my story, here's my experience, thank you for listening and trying to share that. I think the second piece is having that awareness on the broader scale, through media, through other sorts of avenues, things like that, for the general public to be aware that, affordability pressures, yes, they impact everyone, but students in particular are also being hit hard right now. And the final piece, as we discussed earlier, is hopefully seeing some real tangible policy change around that, whether that's increasing the resources available, whether that's universities also saying, how can we provide more needs-based assistance or education around budgeting, all those sorts of things. So I think the first piece is student engagement. The second piece is that broader awareness and engagement with the cause of, student affordability. And then hopefully the third piece, and the most meaningful one, being that policy change.
Well, I know this campaign is just getting off the ground, so we're going to see more, hear more about this. And Lydia, I wish you success and in your studies, as well as with this campaign, trying to at least bring some education to the rest of us about, how things have changed in the last 10, 20, 30 years, or even in the last 2 or 3 years. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sheldon.
Lydia Houck is the Executive Director of Students Nova Scotia.